Countries are rethinking their economic reliance on China amid the global pandemic. Some are trying to lure businesses away from China. A Taiwan expert was one of the first officials from outside mainland China to visit Wuhan after the virus broke out. He sheds light on the issue of human-to-human transmission. From seating candidates at top jobs to leveraging debt relations, how Beijing infiltrated the United Nations in the past decades. The Department of Homeland Security is changing the visa rules for Chinese journalists. New rules aim to protect national security. And more investigations into TikTok, a Dutch privacy watchdog looking into whether or not the app protects children's data well enough. Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Countries are rethinking their economic and supply chain ties to China in the wake of the virus. India is trying to lure U.S. businesses, including Abbott Laboratories, away from China. An unnamed Indian official told Bloomberg that the Indian government has already reached out to over 1,000 companies in the U.S. to offer incentives for moving. It's prioritizing medical equipment, textiles, and auto parts manufacturing. A survey in a Chinese business magazine showed that almost half of the 203 exporters it interviewed are facing serious difficulties as a result of the epidemic and are barely able to maintain their operations. Over 200 million people in China work directly or indirectly in the export industry. This is about a quarter of China's workforce. Now to Taiwan. Taiwan's regional commander of infectious disease prevention, Ying Zhuang, is one of the first officials from outside mainland China to visit Wuhan after the virus broke out. He told the UK newspaper The Telegraph that he arrived there for 2 days trip on January 13th to 14th with experts from Hong Kong and Macau. His task was to determine if the disease could be passed between humans. At the end of 2019, Taiwan authorities saw information on social media about an unknown pneumonia in Wuhan. One official document asked local doctors to find out the number of cases. The Taiwanese government naturally wanted to find out what was going on. When he arrived in Wuhan, Mr. Zhuang heard different accounts from different medical staff and experts. One denied human-to-human transmission. Another one said that limited human-to-human transmission couldn't be ruled out. The Chinese refused to give more information on the case of a husband and his wife, which seemed to show human-to-human transmission. There was a so-called dirty zone at the hospital he visited that only medical staff were allowed into. Mr. Zhuang said just by using his common sense, he could tell that the virus was transmissible. He didn't believe the Chinese regime when it said there were only 41 cases in Wuhan back then. But he couldn't get the real number because it, quote, depends on whether they want to tell you or not. They tried to persuade Mr. Zhuang and the other experts to go out sightseeing, but they always said no because they didn't know how dangerous it was outside the hotel. When Mr. Zhuang went back to Taiwan on January 15th, he confirmed human-to-human transmission to the Taiwan CDC 5 days before the Chinese regime admitted it. This Sunday, here on this channel, we bring you a special report on Wall Street's ties to the Chinese Communist Party, a pandemic impacting the world's people, millions infected with the virus, and one country's cover-up. This Sunday, we take a look at what risks we've long overlooked and what solutions can we find from the wisdom of our founding fathers. Tune in at 9 p.m. on Sunday to find out.
The CCP virus sweeping across the world, striking New York.
We could have prevented the job loss and the death and the sickness and disease around the world had China not lied.
How did we get here?
This decision will go down as the most consequential and the most dangerous mistake in history.
Be careful raising a baby tiger, because one day it will grow up and eat you.
What's the cure for the CCP virus?
The World Health Organization is coming under fire for the way it handled the virus outbreak, and there are growing calls for the organization to disclose its ties with China. The communist regime's influence on the United Nations isn't limited to the WHO. In an interview on Fox News, White House Trade Advisor Peter Navarro said China is trying to control almost every organization within the United Nations. He said over the last decade, China has been aggressively pursuing control of those organizations by getting people elected to top positions. The United Nations has 15 specialized agencies, and Chinese nationals head 4 of them. The WHO's previous Director General is also a Chinese national. Inside the UN's principal organs, Chinese nationals are also taking up lead positions, like the Vice President of the International Court of Justice, who's also a former Chinese ambassador. The communist regime's efforts to grow its influence in the UN have been years in the making. Over 70 years ago, when it seized control of the mainland, Taiwan represented China in the United Nations. After losing the Civil War in the 1940s, China's legitimate government at the time retreated to Taiwan. Meanwhile, the Chinese Communist Party established the current regime on the mainland. A question emerged: who should represent China in the United Nations? With support from the United States, Taiwan maintained its seat in the UN for more than 2 decades. But the tables were turned when the U.S. decided to get closer to China. The turning point came on July 15, 1971, when President Nixon announced his visit to Communist China the following year. On the same day, the communist regime's allies ramped up their efforts to replace Taiwan. They called for the region to take its place, saying Taiwan's position was unlawful. A resolution was later introduced and passed. Of the UN members, over 95% of European countries and over 60% of African countries voted for it. 2 days later, Chiang Kai-shek, then president of Taiwan, officially announced Taiwan's withdrawal from the UN. Chiang wrote, "The United Nations that my country helped form is now a hotbed of evil, and history will prove that the Republic of China's declaration of withdrawal will also be the declaration of the destruction of the United Nations." Today, the Chinese Communist regime's influence on the United Nations is evident. One telling example, China's controversial Belt and Road Initiative. Top UN officials have consistently praised this signature project.
The Belt and Road Initiative has immense potential. Running through Asia, Europe and Africa, and extended to the whole world, it is far-reaching in geography and in ambition.
But it also provides an opportunity for people to see how we can truly unlock those trillions for investments that make sense, because they bring people together, they empower young people, but more especially give jobs to all.
The UN support comes at a time when Beijing is facing growing criticism for overburdening nations with debt and undercutting their sovereignty with the Belt and Road Initiative.
Chinese investment does have the potential to address Africa's infrastructure gap, but its approach has led to mounting debt and few, if any, jobs in most countries. When coupled with the political and fiscal pressure, this endangers Africa's natural resources and its long-term economic political stability.
Beijing funded infrastructure projects in developing countries through the Belt and Road Initiative. Some countries wound up saddled with debt. When they can't repay the loans, Beijing seizes their key assets. Critics call China's lending practices debt diplomacy. China rolled out the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013. Within 6 years, over 150 countries and organizations had come on board. A Chinese consul general says the UN's strong support has contributed to the project's success. Chinese nationals working in key positions in the UN have played a part in this. In 2016, China signed a deal with the UN promising to pour $20 million into its Peace and Development Fund every year for 10 years. Under the terms, the fund has a steering committee which advises the UN Secretary General on projects. 4 of the 5 members are Chinese nationals. One of them is China's Foreign Vice Minister for Foreign Affairs. He now heads the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, or DESA. After the fund was established, China asked DESA to do a study looking at how the Belt and Road Initiative could help with the UN's development goals. A top economist at DESA conducted the study. He also happens to be a Chinese national. The economist arrived at a favorable conclusion. His report says the spirit of the Belt and Road Initiative, quote, is to a large extent in line with that of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. China has been successful at planting its delegates inside the UN. Media reports suggest Beijing was able to do this by leveraging its relationship with Africa. In 2019, China's deputy agricultural minister was elected as the head of the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. He won by a comfortable margin. Over half of the member states voted for him. The UN Food and Agriculture Organization is critical for global food security and agricultural industries. It sets international standards for food and animal safety. French media reports Beijing spent more than $200 million on erasing debt for some African countries and ramping up donations in exchanges for votes. 2 months after, China forgave more than $70 million of debt to Cameroon, a country in Central Africa. Its candidate announced he was quitting the race. China also erased large amounts of debt for other African countries, the Congo, Zambia, Madagascar, and the list continues. The report says China asked its allies to snap a photo of their ballot in the voting booth for evidence of their choice before releasing the funds. The French delegation tried to stop representatives from bringing their phones to the booth, but China and its allies opposed. China holds significant leverage over Africa via its debt. 10 years ago, Africa owed minimal debt to China. Today, Beijing is the largest creditor to Africa. Countries on the continent owe China more than $140 billion. Africa expert David Shin says China is interested in Africa in part because of the political support it can provide in the United Nations. When it comes to voting in UN specialized agencies, numbers count. 54 African countries means 54 votes. In an interview with China Knowledge, Shin said if China has the support of most of the African countries, then it has a big block of votes for defending its position, particularly in a place like the UN's Human Rights Council. 2 years ago, the United States withdrew from the UN Human Rights Council.
For too long, the Human Rights Council has been a protector of human rights abusers.
Haley said countries that perpetrate human rights abuses continue to be elected to the council, such as the Congo, and the world's most inhumane regimes continue to escape scrutiny.
Therefore, as we said we would do a year ago, if we did not see any progress, the United States is officially withdrawing from the UN Human Rights Council.
The communist regime has long been criticized for its human rights violations, and its influence inside the UN continues to expand. This April, China was appointed to the Human Rights Council panel. This gives China the power to choose human rights investigators, those who monitor freedom of speech, enforce disappearances, and arbitrary detention. All of these are rights the communist regime violates. Hillel Neuer, executive director of a UN watchdog group, says the UN's move is absurd and immoral. He tweeted, "That's like making a pyromaniac into the town fire chief." Inside the UN sprawling system, Chinese nationals are not limited to principal organs in key international organizations. Over 20 Chinese nationals hold leadership positions in other UN funds and programs, other entities, and international trade and financial institutions, such as the International Monetary Fund and World Bank. The Department of Homeland Security is tightening the rules for Chinese journalists. New rules are aimed at protecting national security.
Washington issued new rules on Friday regarding visas for journalists from China. Chinese journalists will now only get 90-day visas, but they can be renewed. Previously, the journalists were issued open-ended visas with no extension needed under normal circumstances. The Department of Homeland Security issued the rule while pointing out the Chinese regime's suppression of independent journalism. The rule comes after the Chinese regime kicked out 3 Wall Street Journal correspondents in March and imposed other restrictive measures on U.S. journalists reporting from China. A day before that, the State Department designated several Chinese media operating in the U.S. as foreign embassies. It was done to point out that the companies aren't independent. They're actually state actors pushing Communist Party propaganda. A Department of Homeland Security official said the new rules will likely reduce the number of Chinese journalists in the U.S. and scrutinize those staying here more closely. U.S. officials say the move will strengthen national security protections. The new rules don't apply to journalists from the Chinese territories of Hong Kong or Macau.
And another investigation into TikTok. This time, a Dutch privacy watchdog is looking into whether or not the app protects children's data well enough.
The Dutch Data Protection Authority has launched an investigation into the Chinese video sharing app TikTok. The data watchdog says many children in the Netherlands are using the China-based app, so it wants to find out whether it's protecting their personal information well enough. This isn't the first time the app has been scrutinized. U.S. officials have called the app a national security risk because user data could be given to the Chinese Communist regime at any time. Under China's national intelligence law, Chinese companies inside and out of China must give Beijing whatever data it asks for. Meanwhile, TikTok claims it's not subject to the law. Data Reportal says the app has 800 million monthly active users. The data watchdog is expected to publish its initial findings later this year. Miguel Moreno, NTD News.
American farmers have struggled to get their goods to market because of disruption caused by the pandemic. Some are throwing out food and calling for government help. That's why on Friday, the Department of Agriculture approved over $1 billion to get farm-raised goods to hungry Americans.
The U.S. Department of Agriculture approved $1.2 billion in contracts to help farmers put their excess food to good use, feeding those in need. The funds are part of the administration's Families First Coronavirus Response Act, a move to buy $3 billion worth of excess food from suppliers and deliver it to nonprofits and food banks.
And it's a great testament to the innovation and creativity and the perseverance of the American worker.
Secretary of Agriculture is reassuring the public that the supply chain is stable. His comments follow a temporary shutdown last week for many meat packaging plants after hundreds of employees got sick with the virus. One CEO reminds everyone that it's a tough call to make. He's asking workers to come into work to keep the U.S. food supply chain strong.
So I just want the American people to know that these employees really deserve a lot of gratitude.
The same day the new initiative was announced, the Department of Agriculture revealed that 14 meat processing plants that temporarily closed are opening back up.
From the first day that the coronavirus emerged in the United States up until this very day, the food supply in America has remained strong.
Vice President Mike Pence also commented on the nation's resilient response to the national emergency. Melina Weiskup, NTD News.
California's governor is allowing registered voters in the state to vote by mail. The ballots will start to be mailed to voters 29 days before the election.
Governor Gavin Newsom on Friday signed an executive order to allow every voter in California to submit their ballots by mail. It's the first state to do so. Newsom says it's a way to help people stay safe while still making their voices heard.
There's a lot of concern and anxiety around this November's election in terms of making sure that you can conduct yourself in a safe way and to make sure your health is protected and to make sure that we are reaching out to all registered eligible voters.
Physical sites in California will also operate for anyone who wants to vote in person.
People that otherwise are not familiar with mail-in ballots, are uncomfortable with them, may have disabilities, may have other issues that may preclude that as an appropriate option.
While Democrats say mail-in ballots will help maintain voter turnout, some Republicans, including President Trump, say mail-in votes are more susceptible to abuse on a large scale.
And taking a look at the latest happenings around the nation, more states are inching toward open economies. But Pennsylvania's governor is facing defiance from 2 counties who say he's not moving fast enough. And in New York, unfortunately, 3 children are dead from an unknown disease believed to be linked to the CCP virus. NTD's Melina Weiskup has more.
At least 4 states are inching towards normalcy today. California is one of them, opening flower shops just in time for Mother's Day.
Yeah, it's getting crazy. Phone is just ringing off the hook. Everybody wants to order flowers. They're so happy that we are open.
Beautiful colors to admire, but no smelling the roses for now. In Pennsylvania, some counties are allowed to reopen, but others are under strict lockdown measures. 2 counties announced they'll lift pandemic restrictions ahead of governor's orders. As for the nation's virus hotspot, New York's hospitalization rate and new cases continue to drop.
You see, it hasn't been that level since we started.
But 226 lost their lives yesterday, and 3 children passed away from a rare inflammatory syndrome that Cuomo says may be linked to the virus.
These children happen to have the COVID antibodies or be positive for COVID, but those were not the symptoms they showed when they came in to the hospital system.
Similar events have been reported before by British authorities. Now, the New York Department of Health is working with the state's Genome Center and Rockefeller University to try to understand what happened. Melina Weiskup, NTD News.
The CDC has asked New York to create national criteria for finding and treating the unknown disease. As lockdown orders still stretch over much of the nation, the U.S. military is taking time to thank those helping to keep the country running. In a tribute to first responders, 2 elite flight squads, the Navy's Blue Angels and the Air Force's Thunderbirds, have been soaring above some of the cities and states hit hardest by the health crisis.
1,500 feet above New York City, the Navy's Blue Angels and the Air Force's Thunderbirds streaked through the sky above the U.S. virus hotspot on April 28th. The 2 squadrons usually don't fly within 150 miles of each other, but they received special permission to thank first responders, military personnel, and essential workers. The same day, the 2 teams put on a similar show over Pennsylvania's largest city, Philadelphia. Days later, on May 1st, Air Force pilots paid tribute to frontline workers in a flight over Arizona. They were joined by Arizona Air National Guard aircraft, combining to perform the 15-jet spectacle. Later that day, the Blue Angels flew their F-18 jets over New Orleans, Louisiana to show their gratitude. Next came Oklahoma, which received a similar military salute. Also on the schedule, the nation's capital. Both squads roared above attractions like the National Mall, the Washington Monument, and the Marine Corps War Memorial on May 2nd. The jets also took the skies above nearby Baltimore and Prince George's Hospital in Maryland the same day. Later that afternoon, the groups each flew over downtown Atlanta, Georgia, greeted by thousands of enthusiastic audience members on the ground. Back on April 11th, the Thunderbirds also performed above the glitz and glam of Las Vegas. And their latest stunt so far, the Blue Angels have taken flight over the palm trees and blue waters native to Florida. The tributes came as Americans in some states begin to emerge from lockdowns and stay-at-home orders.
Hopefully it brings them a little bit of a sense of pride. Hopefully it brings them a sense of hope and reminds us all that, we're all Americans in this battle together.
The flyover tributes to first responders are part of a mission dubbed Operation America Strong. The eye-catching idea to give back reportedly came from service members themselves.
Here at China in Focus, we dedicate ourselves to bringing you truthful, unbiased reporting. Don't forget to subscribe for the latest updates, and see you next time.